Hello geographers, and welcome to another video on your changing economic world topic looking at the UK economy. Today what we're going to be having a little bit of a look at is the impact of industry on the physical environment. So we're going to be thinking about what those impacts are. We are mostly going to be focusing on the negative in the first part of today's lesson because unfortunately a lot of our industries do exactly that. They have quite a negative impact upon the area directly around them and perhaps even further afield. But what we're going to then do is have a think about how, if these industries are going to stick around for a little bit, so for example, if we are going to have oil refineries as part of our UK economy for a little while longer, what we can be doing to make those types of industries more sustainable and have either less of a negative impact upon the environment or maybe even a positive one. So just to show you where this is upon your specification, this is exactly where we should be looking, and part of this, as you will see highlighted, will require you to have understanding of an example. So we are going to be looking at a little case study today as well. So we'll start first of all by thinking about those impacts. And again, you're probably going to find yourself focusing on the negative here whilst we're working through this example. So you should have these 4 photographs in your workbook, and I'd like you to find that now. And you'll notice that there is some space around them. So what I'm going to give you now are just a couple of minutes or however long that you need, because you are going to be the one pausing this video, to have a think about what the impacts of these industries' pictures could be upon the environment around them. So again, remember that the environment is not just on the floor. We need to think about water, air, as well as the biodiversity and perhaps even underground as well, because that obviously plays quite a big part in some of these industries in particular. So what I'd like you to do now is just pause this video to annotate around your photographs to identify some of those impacts, and then we will run through together once you are ready. Okay, so hopefully you've had an opportunity to have a look through all of those individually and come up with some of your own ideas. Let's have a little run through some of the things that you could have said. So the first thing is that if you are going to put an industry somewhere, you're probably going to have to get rid of what was there initially. And it tends to be something that is quite natural because we're not massively keen on these areas being right next to these industries, but being right next to urban environments. So you're going to be clearing an ecosystem, and of course that's going to have a detrimental impact before you've even started your industry itself. We also need to think about the roads that are involved, because often they also need built, and that is going to involve, again, some clearance of ecosystems, but also the emissions associated with transport along that new road are going to be quite significant in lots of cases. During construction, during transport, and during even the process of the industry working in itself, you are going to get noise pollution. And yes, this is a real type of pollution, and it can have quite a big negative impact upon ecosystems. For example, a lot of birds don't like to be near certain noises. There may be some other animals that tend to get quite shocked at quite loud or sudden noises, so they will tend to move out of the area, and therefore there will be a big impact upon that biodiversity. I'm sure you're all familiar of CO2 emissions occurring with lots of industries, and that is something we definitely need to take note of today. You'll probably think that these are perhaps not the most attractive pictures you've seen in the last few days, and that you probably wouldn't want to live near them. And of course, that is an environmental impact as well. If it is changing the look of the environment, then that is definitely something to consider. As well as those CO2 emissions, a lot of industries give out particulate matter. Now, as you'll know from your urban studies, this is the stuff that if you breathe in, it could potentially have quite lasting impacts upon your health, particularly if you are an asthma sufferer. So there are going to be social issues associated with this, but of course remember that there are lots of animals within the environment breathing in as well. So in terms of impact on physical environment, that will still very much be there. I've put this one next to this photograph because it looks quite extensive, the industry going on here. And as well as that clearing of ecosystems, there may also be a loss of farmland. Now that will be problematic if you have got a dependence upon food supply, not just for people, but perhaps for maybe other animals and livestock elsewhere. So there will be an impact if you do lose that farmland. There'll be a lot of waste that is created as we kind of create whatever it is that we're doing through this industry. There will be waste products and they have to go somewhere. Unfortunately, that's often into landfill, and that can create soil contamination and water contamination if that landfill is leaking into other parts of the ecosystem. Light pollution is very similar to noise pollution. It can put animals off, it can affect biodiversity, and again, it maybe links into that not aesthetically pleasing element that we've discussed as well. A lot of people would much prefer to see the stars in the sky than a big kind of blur of light coming from these industries as they work through the night. The creation of acid rain can be a problem if you've got lots of chemicals mixing in with rainwater. Then you can get that carbonation and that creation of acid rain. So that could potentially also have a detrimental impact upon biodiversity. So the plants will suffer from that. But again, you'll actually potentially increase the rates of weathering in the area, which will have an impact upon the rocks on that physical environment and landscape. And then we've also got water pollution, and that is a big one because, again, anything that leaks into the water, whether knowingly or perhaps through some accidental event such as an oil spill, is obviously going to have an impact upon the water itself, but the biodiversity in the ecosystem living within it. So that is something that we obviously need to be very mindful of as well. And yeah, linking back into those chemical leaks and oil leaks, all potentially leading to that water or soil pollution. Okay, so let's think about this as forward-thinking geographers. All of that stuff sounded pretty awful, so we need to just think about how we can start to make industry more sustainable. Now, the next part of your booklet has these 3 images, and what I'd like you to do now is just have a little bit of a think as to what these images might be hinting at. 3 ways in which we can start making our industries more sustainable. So have a little bit of a think through, and then we will go through and you can perhaps again pause in the second slide here when you see some of the answers that you could have written. But I'd like you to have a think first, because it's always good to allow your mind to kind of wander around the idea of how we make industry sustainable. You may even come up with something that we are not going to discuss today, which will be obviously an extra advantage to you giving this a go first. Okay, so let's have a look at these. So we're going to start with this rather scary looking man at the bottom, and he is obviously involved in the creation of law and enforcing regulations. So one of the things that we can do, and we do in this country, is make sure that there are environmental regulations that are in place for any industry. So there needs to be rules with regards to what they can and can't do, where they can put their waste. There will be environmental officers coming in and checking that all of those regulations are being adhered to. So that will be the first thing that we can do. Now, of course, linked to that, there has to be some repercussions if people aren't doing what they should be. So another thing is that we need to start thinking about heavy fines. So if we just have a look at that box that popped up on the right hand side there before the one on the left. So heavy fines can be imposed if anybody is not listening to the rules and adhering to them, and that tends to obviously put industries off trying to bend and break the rules, because that will obviously mean that they have lower profit. So heavy fines is also a really important part of that. But as well as just having this kind of big brother upon our industries, we also just need to start working differently. So the third thing that's popped up here is an example of that, and it's something called carbon capture storage. So what we're obviously working out now is that carbon dioxide is not good for our environment, it's not good for the changing climate, and unfortunately a lot of our industries do pump out this stuff. So science in the last few decades has been working really, really hard to work out how we capture that. And that can be done in lots of different ways, even if it's just being caught in the kind of chimneys as it exits the industry itself. And then it can be pumped somewhere where it's going to be stored. So often that is going to be underground. So there will be pipelines that will push this carbon underground and store it there instead of it being in the atmosphere, and that will reduce the impact upon changing climate. What I'd like you to do now, just so that you understand this a little bit better, because it will also become really useful to you as we start talking about climate change in our hazards topic, is I'd like you to watch the video in the description box below called Video Link 1. So if you can now just pause this and for a couple of minutes, just take a little look at this clip that shows you a little bit more about carbon capture storage, and you might even choose to make a couple more notes next to this image as you are watching. Okay, so we've covered 3 examples of how we can make our industry sustainable, but as I said at the start, we also need a case study or an example of part of our country and an industry within our country that's actually doing a pretty good job at sustainable industry. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at this place called Fawley Refinery, which is close to Southampton. It's a big oil refinery and it's owned by ExxonMobil. So this is a really important industry to us in the UK because it actually produces 20% of our petrol, diesel and other fuels, and therefore is really important both socially in terms of allowing us to get from one place to another, but massively in terms of our economy, so that we're not having to buy these fossil fuels in from other parts of the world. So it's really important we've got our own supply so that we are energy secure, as I'm sure you will remember looking at when you did your resources topic. So like I said, this is really close to Southampton, but what I would like you to do now is just, again, pause this video, and I'd like you to go to the link that says Southampton location, and it will take you to Bing Maps, which I'm sure you probably wouldn't naturally go to, but it's great because it's got Ordnance Survey maps on there. And I'd just like you to have a little bit of a kind of mooch around on that map around the Fawley Refinery, which will be centred as you open up that link. And just note what is around it. What is the area like? What other land uses are around it? And then we'll discuss that once you've had a go and had a look at that map first of all. So pause now and then restart the video once you've put a few notes into the little box that you've got in your booklet with Fawley Refinery as a title. Okay, so this is the box that I was referring to earlier, and this is just somewhere where we're going to put a couple of things down linked to the location. You won't be filling this entire box because you are probably going to be writing some other things linked to the video I'm going to discuss next. But let's just check that we've got the main features of the location down. So the first thing you probably will have noticed is that this oil refinery is on an estuary. So it's quite important in terms of the environmental region around it. So there's lots of salt marsh and mudflats in the area. You'll also notice that there are other land uses. So there's some buildings around there, there's a school. So it is used by other land users, but ultimately you could also argue that it is still quite rural. It's definitely not right in the middle of Southampton. There are lots of other natural areas around. So there are some woodland in the region. And it's definitely apparent within that map that the waters around this area are not just shared with the salt marshes and the mudflats, but there's also a lot of kind of waterway movements, so lots of recreation areas and tourist areas that are visited frequently and therefore need to be kind of kept in a sustainable way so that they are, we're not losing the tourism industry around Southampton and things like that. If I just quickly go back to my previous slide, because I didn't want to give too much away before I got you looking at that map, I'd just like to show you this little box to the left-hand side, and it's definitely worth writing at least what I've put in bold here into your location. So the salt marsh and mudflats we've been talking about are actually really, really important environmentally. They are classed as a Site of Special Scientific Interest, or a SSSI, because of the ecosystem that exists within them. We identify that that is very important to science and understanding ecosystems, so it does have a very high level of protection. And one of the reasons why is the abundance of birds. So there are 22 species of birds in the area. So what you're probably noticing is that to be plonking an oil refinery next to all of these things initially seems like quite a strange decision. But what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a little video that hopefully shows you how these two very different land uses can actually work and coexist really nicely alongside each other. So the next thing I'd like you to do is I would like you to just pause this video, and I'd like you to go now onto your second video link, the Fawley Refinery one, and I'd like you to watch this video that you can see in front of you now. What you will be doing at this point is perhaps putting some notes in the bottom of this box here in the video notes section, and then we're going to work on expanding some of those ideas a little bit later once you've watched this video. So have a watch of this. For some reason my pause yellow box isn't coming up, but you know the drill by now. Pause this video, watch the video linked below called Fawley Refinery, and then come back here once you're ready to move on with the lesson. Okay, so there was lots of things mentioned, and actually a lot of those things will be in your booklet as a list of 7 bullet points, and so there's no reason to write any of this down because this is all in your booklet already. But if I can just kind of skim really quickly over them so that we've at least covered it together. So one of the things is that actually the way in which this industry is creating energy is actually working at twice the efficiency of a conventional power station. So it is actually, even though it's fossil fuels still, it's still very, very much, kind of cutting edge in terms of efficiency. So it's perhaps the best of a bad situation if you do consider using fossil fuels to be a negative thing. Another thing as well is that actually their energy efficiency improvements have actually led to reductions in their own emissions. And as a result of that, that's the equivalent of taking 250,000 cars off British roads every year. So again, it's not ideal, but it's, there are definitely positives that are showing that this industry is working better than it perhaps could do. One that I really like is the idea of the improvements to the waterways, because this is an example of how this industry is not only reducing its negative impact, but actually making the area around it better. So when they suck up all of the water from Southampton Water every day to cool the industry and the kind of tanks, what they do is they do eventually return it back to Southampton Waters. Before they do that, they purify it. So actually when it goes back into the sea, it tends to be cleaner than when it was extracted, which is obviously brilliant for the biodiversity in the salt marsh. So an example of how this area is actually becoming better. Lots of other things here. So their recycling is brilliant. They've improved it by 80%. That aesthetically pleasing thing we were talking about, and the idea that some of these industries look quite ugly, is not so much a case here, because they've created a tree screen of really mature trees with a very high level of biodiversity in them, which basically hides the kind of region. So it isn't creating an eyesore, which, as we discussed, is going to be really important for things like tourism. And then, of course, it's a local pipeline for petrol, diesel and jet fuel. So it means that that sort of stuff can get pumped straight to places like Heathrow Airport without the kind of miles and transport associated with getting it from somewhere else in the world. And then the final thing as well is that they are working really hard to make sure that any potential contaminants are removed. They use these things called biopoles. So it's basically just like a really posh compost heap, and that effectively removes the contaminants from the area. You may have noticed that the man on the video mentioned that they do have minor oil spills, but they're very, very rare. They're very small, and they do have a team on site to deal with it very quickly, so the impact is actually far less than it perhaps could be. And obviously this is a very stark contrast to the examples of the oil spills that we did when we looked at Nigeria and Shell kind of working within that region as a TNC. So what your next task in your booklet is to work through 3 of the statements. So we just very quickly discussed 7 of those. So you can choose 3 of them to focus in on. And I'd like you to just think about what the knock-on benefits of those things are. So I thought I'd go through one as an example with you. You can choose to use this one if you want. You can pause and copy this out as an example, or you can really test yourself and do 3 completely new ones. But the one that I thought I would choose is the one that I said I liked earlier. So the idea of the water being cleaner than when it was extracted from Southampton Water. So the first thing you'll need to do with each of these is almost just shorten the statement that you are choosing to focus on. So here you can see it's 1 sentence instead of 2. What I then want you to be doing, though, is thinking about the knock-on benefits of that. So if it's cleaner than when it was extracted, we're going to use a connective phrase here in purple. This means that, and then we're going to continue. Any contamination that may have occurred due to other uses of Southampton Harbour, such as boats and other local industries, will be removed. That would be great in itself, but we're going to go even further. We're going to add another connective phrase. So consequently, the ecosystem will be healthier and allow for an increase in biodiversity in the salt marsh. So what I would like you to do now is you're going to pause this video, and like I said, you can use my example as your first one if you like, or you can choose 3 of your own from scratch. And I'd like you to just think about what the knock-on benefits are linked to the statements that I have already given you and are evident already listed within your booklet. I've put some other connective phrases on the bottom left hand side here if you would like to use those instead of this means that and consequently, but you should aim to have at least 1, if not ideally 2 of those within your writing for each of the statements that you choose. So again, pause this now, give this a go, and then once you have done that, we will move on to the final parts of today's lesson. Okay, so hopefully you've given that a go and you've just practiced the process of developing your ideas, thinking about those developed knock-on impacts associated with those sustainable changes or sustainable practices within the Fawley refinery. So we're going to finish today just having a little bit of a think about some maths, because as a geographer, obviously it's really important that you practice these skills every now and then. So to finish, let's have a think about this calculation linked to all of the trucks that are coming in and out of this area, because as we discussed at the start of the lesson, there is going to be a lot of transport associated with this sort of industry. So if we understand that each truck holds 3,700 litres, I'd like you to think about how many trucks would be needed each day to transport 30 million litres of fuel produced every day in this Fawley refinery. So give it a go. I'm going to pause for a brief second whilst you work that out, and then we are just going to check that you've managed to calculate that successfully. Okay, so let's see if we manage to work that one out. So you should have come up with 811 tankers. So I thought it was quite a nice place to finish, because we just need to be conscious of exactly how sustainable this sort of industry can be. It is fossil fuel refining. There is a lot of transport associated with this. So there are going to be some things that are never going to be fully sustainable. And it's important just to remember the limitations of this sort of sustainable industry, because this is the sort of thing that you might get asked in a 9 marker, and you would need to talk about both sides of the story and come up with your view perhaps of, for example, just how sustainable industries can be within the United Kingdom economy. So looking back at those lesson objectives for today, these are the 2 things that we've looked at. We've focused on the impacts of industry on the environment, and you've hopefully got a lovely annotated couple of pictures to give you lots of things that you could talk about in the context of that. And then we've also had a look at not only just how, as the UK, we can take steps to make all industry sustainable, but we've also looked at the Fawley oil refinery near Southampton, so that you have got a named example. So I hope that was all very helpful. Obviously, if you do have any further questions, then your teacher is only an email or a Microsoft Teams message away. So do let us know if we can help in any other way.